Oh, hello. So glad that you could join me this morning for a cup of coffee. You know what I've been thinking a lot about recently? It's Standard. Standard is the premier constructed format of Magic the Gathering. It's certainly the constructed format of Friday Night Magic, but it's also the format that most new players enter the game through. And thus, it is a gateway to the game. It's also outrageously expensive and incredibly hard to keep up with now that cards rotate out twice as often. So just how effective is that as a gateway? Come on. I've also had a lot of friends over this last year who have dropped out of Magic. Now, some of these people were folks who were once regulars at my local game store, while others very close friends of mine who have been playing this game for as long and fanatically as I have. All of them said variations of the same thing. I can't keep this up. The last Standard deck I built was no good in no time at all. It's pre-release again. I missed out on the last one. I'm 2 Standards out of date. My deck is no longer playable, and buying a new one is just too expensive. There was a time where I always had 2 to 3 Standard decks just for me. My wife always had 1. These were decks that had been built by us, refined over time, honed and tested, and had special places in our hearts. Nowadays, I have 1 Standard deck kicking around that holds no special connection to me, and my wife hasn't had a Standard deck in forever. Who can keep up? Who can afford to? They say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Well, I'm not saying Standard is broke, but it'll sure make you broke if you try and play it, so maybe it needs some fixing after all. Blah 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 blah. Here's some of the most important changes that I feel are critically needed in Standard. Let's start with reprints. Block sets need more reprints than they currently have, which is next to none. While this does vary from set to set, out of 200 plus new cards in each set, sometimes only half a dozen or fewer cards are reprints, and seldom are any of them needed. Standard might be the central constructed format, but you have to create connections to the other formats. Otherwise, people who don't primarily play Standard will have no reason to be a part of new set releases, whether it's buying booster packs for Draft or other, attending pre-release, or having a Standard deck to play at Friday Night Magic. Now, I'm not saying that new sets need reprints for the purposes of Modern and other formats. That's just an added bonus. I am saying that new sets need a greater volume of reprints for Standard to get all players interested in what is the current set. If new sets do not have any interest to players of other formats, then you get player stagnation. If new sets have cards players of other formats want, then those players are more likely to see a reason to participate in some way with those sets. The reprinted cards may even interest them in the Standard format. This, of course, would have a positive effect on those other formats as well, as reprints are severely needed for Modern and other formats, and those formats are not getting the needed reprints from supplemental product. It's all interconnected. Strengthening one format strengthens the others. But the vast majority of cards will always be new. But there's a big change needed in the nature of these new cards. Print less jank. It amazes me that some players still don't realize that Wizards of the Coast intentionally designs cards to be bad. This is just so that in a draft environment, players must solve the puzzle of which cards in their hand are good, which are bad, which are amazing, and which are terrible. And thus, this translates into the vast majority of cards in a new set being completely worthless in constructed formats, least of all in Standard. In other words, the amount of jank in new sets is too damn high, and that's not good for Standard. When only a few cards are worthwhile for constructed play, those cards skyrocket in price compared to the hundreds of Standard legal cards that are completely worthless. More constructed playable cards means a greater variety of decks, a greater variety of builds, and that financial cost will be more evenly distributed. When every single deck needs either a Gideon or a Jace, those two cards become outrageously priced. But if there were a greater number of cards that had constructed value, then everyone wouldn't need the same one or two cards in every deck, and prices would be much more likely to calm down. And stop. Before you say that draft would suffer if it wasn't 80% jank or whatever, let me direct your attention to what limited aficionados consider to be the apotheosis of Magic drafting: Cube. In its purest form, Cube is jank-free. The decisions made are in terms of the individual card's power and purpose in your drafted deck. True Cube has no jank, and many other versions have small degrees of it. Sets can be developed with highly relevant cards for Constructed, and these sets can still be made to be an amazing limited drafting experience. These sets can balance reprints with new cards, ensure both a dynamic limited environment while providing a greater number of constructed relevant cards. This is not an insurmountable task. It simply must be a clear goal, and if it becomes one, Standard will indeed move in a positive direction, the least of which will be a reduction of prices for it, and indirectly for other formats such as Modern. But all of these problems pale in comparison to the biggest problem with Standard, the greatest culprit. And boy, is this going to make me unpopular, but I have to say it. Standard needs to rotate less frequently, not more. Magic is about building, but when a set rotates this frequently, it's too fast for new and casual players to keep up. Unfortunately, we've just changed from rotating once per year to rotating twice per year. And what we needed was to slow down rotations, not speed them up. Ideally, Standard should rotate once every 2 years. You heard me. To me, and I feel to a lot of players, this all comes down to the most important aspect of Magic the Gathering: building and refining and piloting a deck you know inside and out, battling uphill with it at times, and dreaming that dream of taking it to victory, even if that victory for folks like you and me is just a game day or a Friday night Magic. Now, that isn't to say I don't want a format with rotation, where the old goes out and the new comes in, but how quickly is too quickly? I didn't comment on the change to Standard rotations until now, but now I'm saying it. It's a huge mistake to rotate this frequently. The changes are too rapid, and while pro and aspiring pro players can keep up, your average Magic player, someone who isn't going to GPs but is just wanting to sit down at the shop and play Friday Night Magic, the people with school, the people with jobs, well, it's harder for them to keep up. Standard is the gateway constructed format to Magic the Gathering, but as it currently stands, that gateway is closed, and only those who can scale the fence can really get in. More reprints, less jank, less frequent rotations. That's the key to unlocking that gate and letting everyone back in. The next level of progression is to become a Magic the Gathering designer. Congratulations, you're hired. Now let's start thinking like an R&D designer. Wait, you mean people actually collect Magic art in addition to collecting Magic cards?